Geopolitical analysts spent decades monitoring the walls, waiting for an external rival to breach the American empire. But history suggests a different end. In Rome, the terminal blow didn't come from the barbarians at the gates. It came from the greed and debt within the Senate. Today, the same fissures are occurring in the American bedrock. Immediately following World War II, American supremacy rested on raw physical output. The foundries of Pittsburgh and the assembly lines of Detroit produced the tangible goods the world needed. At that time, the financial sector existed specifically to serve the requirements of the physical economy. That foundation began to dissolve in the 1980s with the rise of the stock buyback. Industrial giants like Boeing and Intel shifted their focus away from research and development. Instead, they began spending tens of billions of dollars to buy their own shares, a move that inflated stock prices and triggered massive executive payouts, while the actual assembly lines were starved of capital. Capital abandoned the slow, physical world of manufacturing and flooded into high-speed Wall Street hedge funds. By the time the money reached the software sector, the nation's industrial base had been hollowed out. This relentless extraction by corporate elites has left the world's largest military power struggling to maintain the production capacity for a basic 155mm artillery shell. This industrial decline is tied to an economic law known as the Triffin dilemma. Because the dollar serves as the world's reserve currency, the United States is required to constantly pump liquidity out to other nations to keep global trade functioning. Maintaining this global liquidity forces the United States to run permanent trade deficits. To keep the dollar at the center of the financial world, the empire had to offshore its supply chains to China and Mexico, effectively trading its manufacturing base for financial hegemony. Decades of borrowing to maintain this arrangement have pushed the accumulated national debt past $34 trillion. This graph tracks the convergence of two critical numbers between 2024 and 2026. The blue line is the national defense budget. The red line represents the annual interest paid on the national debt. For the first time, the cost of servicing past debts exceeds the cost of the entire military. This is the terminal stage of a debt trap. The government is now issuing new debt for the sole purpose of paying interest on its previous obligations. In 1961, President Dwight D. Eisenhower delivered a final warning to the American public. He spoke of the rising, unchecked power of what he called the military-industrial complex. That complex now dominates Washington's decision-making. For defense conglomerates like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, geopolitical stability represents a direct threat to their quarterly earnings. Their business model requires active conflict. The war in Afghanistan lasted 20 years and cost over $2 trillion. It ended with the Taliban retaking control of the country within days of the American withdrawal. Afghanistan was a strategic failure for the United States government, yet the defense firms managing the logistics reported 20 years of record-breaking growth and consistent dividends. Modern American warfare prioritizes persistence over resolution. Achieving a definitive victory is secondary to maintaining the recurring contracts that keep the assembly lines moving. Sustaining geopolitical flashpoints in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and the Taiwan Strait serves a specific structural purpose. It creates a vacuum that funnels taxpayer wealth directly into the accounts of the defense elite. In 2011, the Occupy Wall Street movement signaled a change in public focus. For the first time since the 2008 crash, the lower classes unified to target the top 1% of wealth holders. Institutional response followed quickly. Media organizations and corporate HR departments began a coordinated emphasis on identity politics. This framework categorizes the population based on race, gender, and sexual orientation, prioritizing specific group interests over shared economic concerns. Highly emotional cultural triggers, debates over race, gender, and abortion, replaced discussions of wealth inequality in the national conversation. Blue-collar workers across different racial and geographic lines, who share the same economic pressures from Wall Street, began focusing their frustration on each other over cultural flashpoints. Horizontal conflict over culture has successfully substituted for the vertical, class-based rebellion that the financial elite feared in 2011. While the political class engages in these cultural shouting matches, the physical condition of the American working class continues to deteriorate. Neighborhoods are currently being hollowed out by a fentanyl epidemic, and a wave of personal bankruptcies that is driving homelessness to record levels. These crises persist without the emergency intervention typically reserved for banking institutions. They represent a slow, chronic erasure of a population that the financialized economy no longer requires. The national debt interest now outpaces the entire defense budget. Industrial giants have been gutted to fund executive payouts. On the streets, the working class is being consumed by drug crises and manufactured cultural divisions. When an empire's foundation is defined by internal institutional rot and elite wealth extraction, its external defenses become irrelevant. No amount of military hardware can stop a collapse that has already happened from within.